On this video, I'm giving you a detailed review of Tekhenu Obelisk of the Sun. Is it a shining light in a bloated Euro genre, or is it going to be overshadowed by its competitors? Hello, I'm Luke Hector from the Broken Meeple, and if this is your first time checking out the channel, then welcome to you. Be sure to check out the rest of the content where you can find everything from reviews to top 10s to solo plays and all sorts of other variety content. And if the game I'm reviewing today takes your fancy, regardless of my verdict, then be sure to check out zatu.co.uk, where you can use my code TBMeeple5 at the bottom of the screen in order to grab yourself a 5% discount on any limit of board games in your basket. Check out the site and see if you can grab yourself a good deal. Tekhenu is another Euro game from Board and Dice designed by Danielle and David. This is another one in the line of games beginning with the letter T that they seem to be obsessed with at the moment. The idea that they can make a line of games all beginning with T and usually being some kind of name that is a nightmare to pronounce. We already have Teotihuacan, or whatever you do with that one. You've now got Tekhenu, there was Trismegistus, you've got Zolkin, and later on you've got Taiwanese Satsuma or whatever. It's getting a little bit ridiculous, guys. I mean, seriously.
We have to wait for Vegeta and Trunks to come out of the hypertonic lion tamer.
That one was on purpose.
When we're trying to find your games on Board Game Geek search, it's a bit of a pain to basically go, right, T, and now what? Come on, make life easier for yourselves.
But your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they didn't stop to think if they should.
It's a fun little gimmick, we poke fun at it, they know it's a gimmick, so, you know, why not just have fun with it? Tekhenu is a Euro point salad style game where you will use dice to perform actions, gain points, and do what you would expect from a typical Euro game. However, where you take the dice from has other implications. You have an obelisk that you twist during the game, and depending on what side of the obelisk the dice are, dictates whether they are in light, shaded, or dark territory. So, not sunny day and dark night, basically. But where you take these dice from, depending on what section they're in, will dictate if they are pure or tainted dice. Some dice are forbidden to be taken at certain times, some are tainted, some are pure, and as well as performing the action based on the colour of the die and the value of the die, you also have an implication later on in the game where you will dictate your turn order and some potential lost points by balancing your dice on these scales, pure versus tainted. So not only are you trying to think about what action you need to do and how powerful it is, you also need to think about whether your scales are going to be wildly out of balance by the time you get to that point, unless you're willing to sacrifice a few points or the potential turn order phase. The actions you perform involve building statues, building up a temple, building quarries, increasing your population, the happiness of your people, or collecting cards which can consist of one-off blessing abilities, technologies which give you ongoing abilities throughout the game, and the also potential of decree cards which are kind of like endgame scoring opportunities. You have 6 different areas that you will be taking dice from in order to perform one of the 6 different type of actions, as well as the potential to also gain resources with the die depending on what colour it is and what value it is. Of course, you're not allowed to produce too much, because if you do, those resources will go on your tainted side of your scales and could impact you later on. As the game goes on, the obelisk will rotate in order to put different areas and different lights at different times. You will also have several occasions where the turn order will be rejigged based on the scales, but eventually you will also have 2 scoring phases, one halfway and one at the very end, and of course, once it's all said and done, the winner is the one with, have a guess.
Of course!
So we'll start off with D for duration. How long does this game take to play, and does it outstay its welcome? That depends on the player count. The game box will tell you that this game can be played in 60 to 120 minutes. Bare minimum. This game can take a fair while, and a lot of that comes down to the inherent issue that this game can generate a lot of analysis paralysis. Now, of course, if you have the perfect group that takes about 2 seconds to think of their turn, you're not going to have this problem. But there is the potential for someone to freeze up with the amount of options here. You have a lot of dice to pick from, and these dice have different implications, and you've got to think further down the line because of the whole balancing scale thing. So it's not unusual for people to freeze up a little bit before it gets to their turn, especially if they don't have a backup plan when someone takes their die. But 60 to 120 minutes, that's kind of if you're playing it solo or 2-player and possibly 3-player. 4 players will not get this game done in 2 hours. I can't imagine it's even physically possible. The setup, the teach and playing this in 2 hours, no way. 3 players will typically take you around that 2-hour mark, and that's assuming you're fairly comfortable with the game, but 4 players, you're definitely looking at the whole 2.5-hour mark. Maybe not quite 3 hours, but that's if you're completely new to the game and there's a lot of analysis paralysis, it can potentially go very long. But being more realistic, after you've got more comfortable with the game, you are expecting this to be a 2-hour affair for most 3-player games, a little bit shorter with 2 and definitely longer with 4. In fact, I dare say with 4 players, this is actually a player count I refuse to play this game with. It just takes far too long. You know, with an analysis paralysis in place, you could be waiting a fair while before it gets round to your turn. And consider, you only really have 16 actions in this game. 16 dice that you will take. And not all of those actions will be to do some big god action, as they're called, where you do one of the major 6 areas of the board. Your action might simply be to produce resources. I take this white 6, I produce 6 limestone resources, my turn is done. Can you imagine how annoying that is? If you have waited a while before your turn, done that, which takes you about 5 seconds, and then you gotta wait again for the turn to get back round to you. You could be waiting a fair while, not doing a huge amount in the game, before it's round to your place again, so the downtime element is definitely one to consider. Now, if you get to play this with the same group all the time, if you're one of these lucky few that has that set up, then you should be able to get the time to a more manageable level, but again, I just really would not want to play this with 4 players. It just takes that bit too long, outstays its welcome for what is a thinky game, but not one that deserves to hit the 2.5 to 3 hour mark. I think 2 hours for this game, 90 minutes to 2 hours, is about right for what you get in here, but that means I'm pretty much capping this game at 3 players. I would rather play this solo than 4 players any day. Now, E for ease of play. How easy is the game to grok? Are the rules fairly simple? Would you be able to pick up and play this game? Well, you're certainly not going to be able to pick up and play it. There's a fair amount of rules in this box, and they're not necessarily the most complex rules, but some of the actions are definitely a bit more long-winded than others. When teaching this game, I tend to do the bottom 3 actions first. They tend to be the most simple. You take the die, you do this, and that's about it. Not too difficult. But then when you get to the top 3 actions, particularly the one where you build up the temple and the one where you build around the temple, those ones are linked with each other and have a few little minor rules you need to gather and get in your head when you're doing the action, because forgetting any one of these could hurt you in terms of points. But then on top of that, you need to understand the concept of the scales. You need to understand the whole pure and tainted dice thing. You need the excess production lock. Everything's got terminology in terms of, oh, you are doing the Horus action. What's the Horus action? Oh, it's the one with about the statues. It's like, oh, okay, whatever. Just say the statue action then. There's a fair amount you've got to absorb, and there's no real quick way to teach this game. You need to be aware of what's going to happen throughout, so I can't really teach you half the rules, get going, and then teach you the other half later. You need to be aware of this stuff. So the game is not too complex to learn in terms of the rule book itself, but there's just a fair amount you need to absorb ahead of time. And the rulebook itself is pretty decent overall. I picked it up, tried to learn the solo mode just from the rulebook, and it took a fair bit of reading, but I didn't have to reread various sections that often whilst going through it. I read the paragraph and went, okay, that makes sense, and that makes sense. But during the game, you are probably going to have to rules check a fair amount in order to get used to it. You do have a couple of player aids to help you through the way, and I certainly recommend you have them out in front of you, particularly as you need to know exactly what die is forbidden, pure and tainted at what time, but also what resource the die produces if that's not already familiar. Thankfully, they took our feedback from the beta of this game and put a nice little diagram on the obelisk disc itself in order to remind you what colours go in what sections of there. If they didn't have that, this would be a complete nightmare. But with that included, it just means that you're going to have to take your time with this game. It's not one that you're going to be able to get stuck in immediately and then just go with the motions. Somebody who is teaching the game needs to be familiar with it first, because getting any rules wrong in this game can have serious repercussions. Now, the tactics and strategy, is this game fun to play? Is it engaging? Is there a lot to think about? This is where there are more pros than cons here. It sounds like I've been kind of meh on the game so far, but to be honest, most of the flaws of this game are in those first two parts. Otherwise though, there's a lot of good stuff here. In terms of the tactics and strategy, there's definitely a lot to think about. Not only the forward planning aspect of balancing your scales, which is a tense decision in itself, but just knowing what actions you're going to do around the board. You can't just focus on one aspect all the way through. Okay, yeah, you might be able to do a small focus on it, like this is where I'm really getting my points, but there's only so many dice. And other people might take those dice. And if you are, even if you're the only person taking the dice from one section, they're going to get used up eventually. And the thing rotates, but dice only appear on certain sections as it rotates. So you can't guarantee you've always got a die for that particular action you want to do. So you need to be flexible. You have to adapt and use other aspects of the game in order to get points elsewhere. Build a statue. And where do you want to build the statue? Do you want to build it in for the people, where it gets you a little bonus or some points later? Or do you want to build it around the obelisk so that when players use that action, you get a bonus? I like doing that quite a lot in this game.
Remember me! Remember me!
But then on top of that, you've also got the cards. The cards, you might argue, are not necessarily the best thing to collect a ton of, because you've only got 16 actions in the game and you're using one to collect a bunch of cards. Don't underestimate them though. Those blessings can be a godsend, no pun intended, with trying to get ahead in this game or get that acceleration you need. The technologies vary in terms of their power. Some of them I just think, why would I really care about grabbing that? And some of them are like, oh yeah, I really want that technology. And the actions themselves are mostly very different. Building a statue has different implications than getting the cards, to building the temple, to building the quarry and limestones. And you always think, oh, I need a bit more of this, and you never quite have enough. You always want just that little bit of extra limestone, that little bit of extra bread to feed your people. And don't worry, there's no crazy feed your people mechanic in this. You have houses that you build, buildings basically, that you put at certain times, and the more of those you build, the more bread you have to pay at a couple of occasions in the game. It really is not like an Uwe Rosenberg style feed mechanic here, so don't worry too much about that. But really, the biggest pro of this is just that choosing of the dice itself. I like this obelisk mechanic, the idea that the dice change function at different times. I might think, well, I can't do this action because everything's forbidden, but bide my time, they're going to free up in a minute and there'll be pure dice. Perfect, I need some pure dice, so maybe I'll do something first with a tainted die, put it on that side of the scale, and then when it rotates in a minute, I can then do this action. But then, of course, turn order is a big deal in this game, more so than most other games I've ever played. People might think, oh well, I'll just go third or fourth, it's not that big. Yes, it is. There's only so many dice on there, and if somebody takes the die you want, it can mess you over. This is not the most forgiving game I've ever played. There are worse, far worse in terms of being punishing, but yeah, if people take the dice you want or you make a mistake, you're probably gonna feel it in the gut at some point, because it's, you've only got those 16 actions and you don't get bonus actions. You can get a bit more flexibility with your actions, but it's not like you can have 24 actions in the game. You have your 16 and that's it. And believe me, you wish you had a lot more actions. So moving on to A for aesthetics, and this is a little bit on the mediocre side as well. There's a lot of iconography in this game, and the graphic design for the most part is pretty decent. The icons are clear. I never really had to squint at a card to figure out what that little symbol was. Things are generally quite clear on the board. It looks busy at first glance, but then you quickly realise, oh yeah, that section's its own thing, that section's its own thing. And they do put a lot of decent little reference aids, both in iconography format, however, where your scoring aspects need to be considered, and particularly with those two actions I mentioned before with the temple that are a bit more, shall we say, long-winded. It's a good thing they put them there. And they put little icons like the hourglasses to remind you that in the scoring phase you need to consider this. So they definitely put as much effort as they could to make it relatively user-friendly and not too busy. Where this game is a little bit more lackluster though is the obelisk itself and the art. The obelisk is cool. It's nice to have this 3D piece in the middle of the board, and it certainly stands out. But trying to keep it in place when you twist it round so you don't accidentally nudge it out of its hole, and by hole I literally mean just a tiny little cutout bit in the board, it's hit and miss. There's plenty of times where it's been knocked over or you twist it round and it falls out of place. I would have liked some way to be able to properly lock it in place and twist it round, even if it required more effort. It, you know, probably would have upped the cost of the game, but still, you can sometimes be a little bit frustrated with getting that obelisk and getting it to stay in the cutout space where it needs to be. The artwork is also relatively bland. I mean, it's Egyptian settings, there's only so much you can do with an Egyptian setting in terms of artwork, but it's a lot of browns, it's a lot of beiges, the dice themselves are fairly standard dice, they're not custom dice in any way, it's just 4 different colours. Is it 4? 4 or 5, something like that. And, you know, the artwork is decent enough and you can see what's going on, but it is still fairly basic. This isn't going to win any art awards, but then it doesn't look horrible either. It's just very nicely in a neutral position in the middle. It's not necessarily going to turn an eye if someone walks past the table, but you're probably too engrossed in trying to decide which die you want to take to care too much anyway. I for Immersion. Does the theme get you within its setting and keep you there? Not really. This is a Euro mechanical game through and through. Just because you name the gods after Egyptian gods and say, well, the solo mode has a little temple thing and, you know, this is a sarcophagus here and that, it doesn't really make a difference. You could have used any civilization with this game and it probably would have still worked. Was Egyptians the only ones that used obelisks? I'm not entirely sure, but when you're playing this, you don't really care it's an Egyptian theme at all. It's very mechanical. Not to say that it's bad mechanically, but you're not buying this because you like Egyptian themes here. You're buying this because you want a Euro game with a lot of thinky aspects to it. It's a bit of a shame. I would have liked there to be a little bit more effort with trying to get the theme to be immersive, but then to be honest, with these lines of games, you're not necessarily in it for the theme anyway, although I would argue that some of the other games did a slightly better job. Teotihuacan has a little bit abstracted in places, but I feel the theme in that was a little bit stronger than this one. Trismegistus actually does a reasonable job with its theme. Yeah, okay, it's very mechanical, moving cubes from one bit to the other, but it feels like you're doing an alchemy style game. And even Zolkin, you know, actually, yeah, okay, it's mechanical with those wheels, but there were good aspects to it that made that theme slightly better. Here, though, I reckon you could replace the theme with most things and it would still work fine, you just have to change the iconography. And finally, L for longevity with the replay value of this game. This is pretty decent actually. You've got a lot of those cards there and you're not going to see a lot of them in each game. In fact, chances are you won't even be able to access a lot of them during the game because you have to raise your population and happiness in order to access more cards. You'll probably see a few of the blessings recycle themselves, but those decree cards, you're going to have a lot of opportunities to sort of go, you know, I'll try that one this time, I'll try that one this time. And a lot of paths to victory can open up, very different paths. I've had times where I've focused on a particular couple of god actions. I've had times where I've literally gone, you know what, I don't care too much, as long as I stockpile a ton of resources by the end of the game, I'm good. I've had ones where I'm so obsessed with the happiness meter, ones where I just want to grab every technology on the planet. You can have a lot of distinct games, even though the mechanics stay the same. Your sort of task and, you know, shall we say, goal or your means of getting to an end can be very distinct on multiple games. On top of that, you also have a solo mode in here designed by David Turksey, and you know, when it comes to mechanical Euro games, his solo modes are pretty decent. It's very similar to what Teotihuacan used, with a small little pyramid of tiles that you essentially dictate what action the AI does based on an aspect of the, you know, a mechanical aspect. Here it's based on essentially a coin flip of this token, which dictates what next action in the pyramid it goes for. Now in Teotihuacan it was a bit fiddly to use. There was a lot of rules to learn for it. It was certainly a bit more like, whoa, this is quite a lot to absorb for a solo mode. In here, I'm pleased to say it's been streamlined and simplified a bit. Yes, you still need to know what the AI is going to do whenever they take a particular god action, so there will be a bit of rules checking here and there, but using the pyramid, just flipping that coin and letting the AI do its thing, not as difficult as it was in Teotihuacan. And as I mentioned before, I would sooner play the solo mode in this rather than 4 players.
This is why Superman works alone.
Because you could get the solo mode of this done in about 60 minutes. Longer if you're having to do a lot of rules checking, but once you're comfortable and you've got the game set up, because there is a bit of a setup time with this one, then you could get this done in about an hour, 90 minutes if you really take your time. But that's not a bad length for a solo Euro game, and to be honest, there's not a huge amount of player interaction in the game other than somebody took my piece, so the idea of playing a solo is actually quite appealing and I've had some good fun playing it. And of course, this adds to the replay value in general, knowing that if you can't get a group together, you have another way of experiencing the dice obelisk mechanic. So my final word on Tekhenu is that this is a solid Euro in the lineup of T games, whatever you want to call it. It's thinky, it's unforgiving without being quite so punch in the face punishing, but the mechanics in it are interesting. I like the dice in the obelisk and how it changes function over time. It's really cool. The actions around the board are very distinct. The cards with the blessings, the technologies and the decrees increase the value of the game in terms of having very distinct paths to victory, and on top of that you've got the solo mode as a nice bonus that is actually decent to play. Now it is limited a bit though by the fact that I would refuse to play this with more than 3 players, and that the analysis paralysis can lead to a fair amount of downtime, particularly if you are crazy enough to play this with 4 players. And I would have liked some of the aesthetics to be a little bit improved in terms of its artwork and the obelisk itself, but those are relatively small quibbles. And again, I would have liked there to have been a bit of a stronger theme to go with it. So there are a few things that hold it back a bit, so I can't quite give this the distinction level verdict, but I have no problems in giving this a solid 8 out of 10 and a seal of endorsement. It's a really good Euro game that fits nicely in that lineup of games. It's got some interesting mechanics, it's got plenty of replay value, it's got certainly a nice thinky aspect to the game without being too punishing that it punches you in the face repeatedly. All in all, it's still good fun and a solid mechanical game to play. You just have to accept that that is essentially what you're getting into. A mechanical game, forget the theme, just enjoy that obelisk and the way the dice work, because that is easily the highlight point of this game. Now I hope you've been enjoying the content on the Broken Meeple channel, including this video, but I'm not the only person you should check out to get your ideas on what board games to have. Always check out as many opinions as you can. So as well as my opinion, whether you want to listen to it or not, I suggest you also check out...
Hi, my name's Andy Savage and I have a board game channel called One Man and His Meeple, where I do full solo playthroughs with a dash of strategy talk. No setup, no lengthy rules explanations, no reviews, just straight into the game. Here you'll find medium to heavyweight games played with the official rules, unofficial variants, 2 or 3 handed against myself, or sometimes online. If solo is your thing, or if you want to know if solo gaming might be something you could get into, then why not check it out?
So that's it for me on this video review of Tekhenu. If you liked what you see and I've earned your subscription, then please click the avatar in the center of the screen to subscribe and hit the bell for future notifications. Until next time, feel free to check out the most recent content on my channel or my personal selection at the bottom. Until next time, remember, it's only a game.